As of now, when we run the app, we can't see anything in our scene. And to change that, I will now open my gamescene.sks file where we can just use a visual editor. Pretty similar to working with a storyboard to add all of our elements. I will begin by zooming out a bit to get a better overview of my scene. And I can then clearly see this rectangle. That is my scene. If I select the attributes inspector in my right column, I can specify the size of my scene, which as of now is set to custom with a fixed width and height. I now want to set this in a way that we have the maximum size our scene will be displayed in. Therefore, I will select iPad Pro 12.9 inches as its size. This iPad is the biggest iOS device available, currently available, I should say. If we now plan and lay out our scene in a way that fits this screen, it should automatically be scalable for all the other small screen sizes as well. The scene will be about the size of the iPad screen, and on smaller screens, we would then work with panning and zooming to be able to see our complete scene. I can then set the anchor point for my scene, which is currently set to 0.5 and 0.5, but I kind of want to move my anchor point, which will influence the positions of any child nodes. And I want to move it to the bottom left corner. And I can do so by setting it to 0 and 0. I should then see it displayed in the bottom left corner with this little cross. To start off, we will now add two elements to our scene, a tile map and a background image. Therefore, I will, in my library, search for the TileMap node, which I can then just drag and drop into my scene file. I can then position it so that it is in the bottom left corner of the scene with our anchor point as the origin point. We will then, for the TileMap node, as well set the anchor point to be 0 and 0. So while having selected the TileMap node, we will, in the inspector, set this to 0 and 0. And when I've done this, I have to reposition my tile map to be in the corner again. And I now want to make sure that it covers our whole scene. As of now, we can see that it is only covering about half the scene. So we should probably change its size. However, I can't just change its size by dragging it around like so, since this won't change the size, but the scale. And as we can see in the right column here, that's not what we want to do. So let's undo this. And what I want to do instead is edit the tile size and map size properties in the right column, where we can set columns and rows and the size of each individual tile. For this tile size, I will change it to 64 by 64. So double the current value. And we can directly see the change that it causes for our map in size. It is now slightly too big for our scene. And since I want it to be as close as possible to the iPad size, I will change the columns to 22 and the rows to 16, so that we can see the map that is slightly bigger than our scene. Before I am able to add tiles to my map, I want to add a background. So a background image for our scene. To do so, I will just use a simple sprite node, which I can get by dragging a color sprite object from my library to the scene. I can then set a texture for this sprite node, but since we don't have any images in our project yet, there's nothing for us to select here. So let's head over to our asset catalog, where I want to add some assets from my resource folder. To begin, we want to drag in the two graphics, grassmid.png and grassbackground.png. To be able to use grassmid image as a tile for our map, I will create a new file in my project. If I scroll down a little in the template selection, I will find under the Resource tab an entry Sprite Kit tileset, which is exactly what I want to select. I want to create an empty tileset so that we are able to add the tile graphics on our own. And I can then select a name for my tileset to create it, and I will just call it Bird Tileset. In the new tileset, I already find an empty tile group containing a tile, and this is where I want to add my tile graphic. I can add the bottom right corner, select the media library, which will show me all the assets that I have available in my project, and I can then just take the grass mid image and drag it onto the tile here. I will then select the tile at the bottom, and in the inspector, I can see the size being 70 by 70. But since our TileMap is using 64 by 64, we need to change this here. I don't really have to rename anything here, since we won't add a lot of different tiles. But this is only in this case. So let's jump back into our game scene file, where we can set our background and add some tiles. If I select my TileMap node right here, I can, for the property tileset, which does currently not have a valid value, select my newly created tileset from the dropdown. As soon as I've done that, I can double click on my TileMap, which will bring me into editing mode. If you want to learn more about working with and editing tile maps, I highly recommend that, if you haven't already, check out our videos about the SK TileMap node in the section about the Sprite Kit basics. I don't really want to go into too much detail here. We have our tile group from the tile set selected at the top here. And if I select the pen, I can just draw the tiles into my TileMap. I just noticed that by selecting our tile set, our tile size has automatically changed again. So let's undo this by resetting it to 64 by 64, which will close the gaps between our tiles. The reason for this automatic change is that in our tileset file, if I select the tileset in the navigator, the default tile size is still 70 by 70, which is what automatically gets set for our TileMap when we assign the tileset to it. Had I changed this value to 64 by 64 beforehand, it wouldn't have happened. Alright, we've now drawn a floor for our scene. So let's take care of our background sprite node next and change it from a red square to an actual image. Since I now do have images in the project, I can, for the texture, just select our grass background and position it accordingly. First off, I want to add it as a child node to my TileMap node, simply by dragging it up a bit in the navigator, like so. I can then reposition my background and make it slightly bigger, so that it covers the whole scene. As of now, the background is drawn over our TileMap node, but I can easily fix this by having selected the sprite node, setting its C position to -1, like so. And we can then see our tiles again. Now don't get confused by the parts that are overlapping our scene here. If I select my TileMap node, which is pretty much exactly our scene size, I can tell you that anything that is not inside of the boundaries of this frame will just be cut off in the game. We now have a background image and a floor consisting of tiles. So we can take a look and see how this looks when the app is actually running. I'll start by running it on the iPad Pro to see the maximum dimensions of our scene. The app started. We can see our background and the floor tiles. And it's pretty much exactly the frame that we've designed in the SKS file. Only the parts of our background image that overlap have been cut off, which is exactly what we want. Let's also run this on a smaller device like an iPhone and see how it looks. I'm going to select the iPhone 10 and take a look. After the app started, I can see that the iPhone just displays the center part of our scene, as much of it as it can possibly fit on the screen. By default, we just have this area from the center of our scene, but it might not be what we want for our game. It would probably be better if we saw the bottom left part of our scene, which is where we, later on, will be adding our birds and therefore starting our levels. So let's take a look at how we can fix this to have a similar starting point regardless of which device we're using. We will of course always see a little more of our scene on bigger devices, but we want to at least start with the same perspective across all devices.